A Little History of the World by E.H. Gombrich, Chapter 40, The Small Part of the History of the World Which I Have Lived Through Myself, Looking Back. It is one thing to learn about history from books, and quite another to experience it oneself. That is what I wanted to remind you of just now when I likened a glimpse of the past of mankind to the view seen from an aeroplane flying at a great height. All we can make out are a few details on the banks of the river of time, but when seen from close up, with the waves coming toward us one by one, the river looks quite different. Some things are much clearer, while others are barely visible, and that's how I found it. In the last chapter I told you about the terrible World War of 1914 through 1918. Although I lived through it, I was only 9 years old when it ended. So when I wrote about it, I still had to rely on books. In my final chapter, I would like to tell you a little about what I actually did experience. The more I think about it, the stranger it seems. The world is now so utterly different from what it was in 1918, and yet so many of the changes that occurred happened so imperceptibly that we now take them completely for granted. When I was a boy, there were no televisions, no computers, no space flights, and no atomic energy. But it's easy to forget the most important change, and that is that there are so many more people in the world today than there were then. Toward the end of the 1914 through 18 war, there were more than 2 billion people on our planet. Since then, the figure has more than doubled. Of course, numbers as big as that don't mean much to us because we can't actually picture them to ourselves. But if we bear in mind that a line drawn round the Earth at the level of the equator would measure roughly 40 million meters, and that when people form queues in front of a ticket office, there are roughly 2 of them to a meter, it means that 80,000 people waiting patiently in a queue would reach all the way around the world. Sorry, that's 80 million people waiting patiently in a queue would reach all the way around the world. The queue, when I was a boy, would have gone around 22 times, and today, with our 4,500,000,000 fellow inhabitants, the queue would reach more than 50 times round the Earth. Then you must also realize that throughout the time that the population was multiplying at such a tremendous rate, the globe we all inhabit was imperceptibly growing smaller and smaller. Of course, I don't mean literally shrinking, but technology, and in particular that of flying, kept on reducing the distance between the various parts of the globe. This was also something I experienced myself. Whenever I find myself in an airport and hear a succession of announcements of flights from Delhi, New York, Hong Kong, or Sydney, and see the swarms of people preparing to depart, I can't help thinking of my youth. In those days, people would point at someone and say, "He's been to America," or "She's been to India." Today, there are hardly any places in the world that can't be reached in a matter of hours. Even if we don't go to far-off countries ourselves, they seem closer to us than they were in my youth. Whenever a major event happens anywhere in the world, we read about it in the newspapers the next day. We hear about it on the radio and see it on the television news. The inhabitants of ancient Mexico knew nothing about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it is unlikely that anyone in China ever heard of the effects of the 30 Years' War. But by the First World War, things had changed. The very fact that it was known as a world war was because so many nations had been drawn into the fighting. Naturally, that doesn't mean that all the news which now reaches us from all over the world is true. One of the things I learned was not to believe anything I read in the newspapers. I'll give you an example. Because I lived through the First World War myself, I thought I could believe everything I had heard about it at the time. That is why the last chapter, Dividing Up the World, is not quite as impartial as I had intended. The role played by America's President Wilson was not at all what I had imagined. I described a situation in which Wilson made promises to the Germans and Austrians which he failed to keep. I firmly believed that what I remembered had to be right. After all, it was part of my own experience, and when I wrote about it later, I just wrote down what everyone believed. But I should have checked my facts. All historians must be especially careful to do. To cut a long story short, President Wilson did indeed make a peace offer early in 1918, but because Germany and Austria and their allies were still hoping to win the war, they ignored it. Only when the war had dragged on for 10 more months and they had been defeated with very heavy losses were they prepared to accept the president's proposal, but by then it was too late. Quite how serious and regrettable this error of mine was rapidly becoming quite how serious and regrettable this error of mine was rapidly becoming apparent. For, although I did not foresee it, the fact that all those who had been defeated were convinced that their suffering was the result of a gross deception was very easily exploited and transformed by ambitious and fanatical agitators into a raging thirst for vengeance. I am reluctant to name them, but everyone will know that the one I have most in mind is Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been a soldier in the First World War, and he too remained convinced that, had it not been for the supposed deception, the German army would never have been defeated. But he didn't just blame Wilson. In his eyes, the enemy's propaganda had been crucial in persuading the Germans and Austrians at home to abandon the soldiers at the front to their fate. Hitler was therefore determined to trump the enemy in the art of propaganda. He was a brilliant popular orator and drew huge crowds. He knew there was no better way to incite a mob to action than to give them a scapegoat, someone they could blame for their suffering, and he found one in the Jews. The fate of this ancient people has been touched on several times in this book. I described their voluntary segregation and the loss of their homeland with the destruction of Jerusalem, and their persecution during the Middle Ages. But even though I come from a Jewish family myself, it never entered my head that such horrors might be repeated in my own lifetime. Here I must confess to another error that slipped into the history, but one for which I might perhaps be excused. In chapter 33, it says that a truly new age began in which people started to turn their minds away from the brutality of earlier times, because the ideas and ideals of the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century had by then become so widespread that people took them to be self-evident. At the time that I wrote that, it seemed to me inconceivable that anyone might ever again stoop to persecuting people of a different religion, use torture to extract confessions, or question the rights of man. But what seemed unthinkable to me happened all the same. Such a painful step backward seems almost beyond our understanding, and yet it may be no harder for young people to understand than it is for adults. They need only open their eyes at school. School children are often intolerant. Look how easily they make fun of their teacher if they see him wearing something unfashionable that the class finds amusing. And once respect is lost, all hell breaks loose. And if a fellow student is different in some minor way in the color of their skin or hair or the way they speak or eat, they too can become victims of hateful teasing and tormenting, which they just have to put up with. Of course, not all young people are equally cruel or heartless, but no one wants to be a spoilsport, so in one way or another most of them join in the fun, until they hardly recognize themselves. Unfortunately, grown-ups don't behave any better, especially when they have nothing else to do or are having a hard time, or sometimes when they just think they are having a hard time. They band together with other real or supposed companions in misfortune and take to the streets, marching in step and parroting mindless slogans filled with their own importance. I myself saw Hitler's brown shirt supporters beating up Jewish students at Vienna University, and when I was writing this book, Hitler had already seized power in Germany. It seemed only a matter of time before the Austrian government would also fall, so I was lucky to be invited to England just in time before Hitler's troops marched into Austria in March 1938. After that, in Germany, anyone who greeted someone with a simple good morning and not a Heil Hitler was taking a very grave risk. In this type of situation, it soon becomes all too clear that the eyes of the supporters of this sort of movement, there is only one sin, disloyalty to the Führer or leader, and only one virtue, absolute obedience. To bring victory closer, every order had to be obeyed, even if it ran counter to the laws of humanity. Of course, similar things have happened at earlier times in history, and I have described many of them in this book. For example, when I wrote about Muhammad's first disciples, the Jesuits too were said to place obedience above all else. I also touched briefly on the victory of the communists in Russia under Lenin, and there too there were convinced communists who would not tolerate any opponents. Their ruthlessness in the pursuit of their goal knew no bounds, and millions died as a result. In the years that followed the First World War, tolerance also vanished in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The politicians of those countries told their fellow countrymen that they had been cheated when the world was shared out, and that they too had the right to rule over other peoples. The Italians were reminded of their ancient Roman ancestry, the Japanese of their warriors, and the Germans of the old Germanic tribes, of Charlemagne, of Frederick the Great. People, they were told, were not of equal value. Just as some breeds of dog were better at hunting than others, they themselves belonged to the best race, the one designed for ruling. I knew a wise old Buddhist monk who, in a speech to his fellow countrymen, once said he'd love to know why someone who boasts that he is the cleverest, the strongest, the bravest, or the most gifted man on earth is thought ridiculous and embarrassing, whereas if instead of I, he says, we are the most intelligent, strongest, bravest, and most gifted people on earth, his fellow countrymen applaud enthusiastically and call him a patriot. For there is nothing patriotic about it. One can be attached to one's own country without needing to insist that the rest of the world's inhabitants are worthless. But as more and more people were taken in by this sort of nonsense, the menace to peace grew greater. Then, when a serious economic crisis in Germany condemned vast numbers of people to unemployment, war seemed the simplest way out. The unemployed would become soldiers or work in the armaments factories, and in this way the hateful treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain would be wiped off the face of the earth. Not only that, but the Western democratic countries, France, Britain, and the United States, had become so softened by years of peace, or so it was thought, that they were hardly likely to defend themselves. Certainly no one there wanted a war, and every effort was made to avoid giving Hitler an excuse to bring calamity down on the world. But sadly, a pretext can always be found, and if need be, incidents can be arranged. So on the first day of September in 1939, the German army marched into Poland. By that time I was already in England, and witnessed for myself the profound sadness, but also the determination of those who had to march off to war again. This time there were no cheerful battle songs and no dreams of glory. They were just doing their duty, for the madness had to be stopped. My task was to listen to German broadcasts and translate them into English, so as to know what German listeners were being told, and what they were not being told. This meant that from 1939 to 1945, I was in the curious position of living through all 6 years of that terrible war on both sides, as it were, in very different ways. At home in England, I saw determination, but also anxiety for men at the front. The effects of air raids and the fear at the turns the war was taking. From German radio broadcasts, all I heard were cries of triumph and outpourings of abuse. Hitler believed in the power of propaganda, a faith which seemed justified with the success of the first 2 years of the war. The successes of the first 2 years of the war exceeded even his wildest expectations. Poland, Denmark, and Norway, Holland and Belgium, France, large parts of Russia and the Balkans were overrun, and only Britain, that little island on the edge of Europe, still held out. And even that resistance could surely not last long, for, to the sound of the trumpet fanfares, the German radio ceaselessly proclaimed how many ships carrying supplies and armaments intended for the British had been sunk by the U-boats. But when, without any declaration of war, in December 1941, the Japanese attacked the American fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor and virtually destroyed it, and Hitler took it upon himself to declare war on the United States, and when in the autumn of 1942 the German troops were beaten back in North Africa and defeated by the Russians in January 1943 outside Stalingrad, and when the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, proved powerless to prevent the Allies' devastating bombardments of German towns, it became clear that it takes more than fine words and fanfares to win a war. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in England at a time when the outlook was grim, he said, "I can promise nothing but blood, sweat, and tears." And it was precisely because he had said that we also believed him when he held out a glimmer of hope. But how many German listeners paid any attention to the justification and promises that I heard day in, day out on the German radio is anyone's guess. And we'll pause there.